There's been a lot of speculation over the past few months as to who Donald Trump is going to pick as his vice presidential nominee. And of course, the topic of today's video is to talk about what Governor Glenn Youngkin could potentially add to a Trump ticket, whether or not he can realistically expand the electoral map, and how much of an impact the vice presidential pick actually has on a presidential ticket. So we're going to get to all that and more in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So there's been a lot of talk in the political world on Virginia for the past few months, as polls in the state have been oddly very tight for a state that typically is reliably Democratic. If we take a look at the RCP average, Joe Biden is leading in the state of Virginia, but he's only up by 2.2%. Now, for comparison, he won the state in 2020 by over 10 points, and in 2016, Hillary Clinton won Virginia by over 5. In fact, you have to go back to 2004 to George W. Bush's re-election to the last time a Republican won the state of Virginia. So Virginia's not exactly a red state or even a purple state. It's definitely a blue state, especially in the era of Trump, which is why it's so odd that Donald Trump is polling as close to Joe Biden as he is. Now, most of the reason for this, I believe, is the fact that Joe Biden is polling poorly as opposed to Donald Trump polling well. In fact, Donald Trump is polling about where Republicans have typically polled in Virginia, around that 43-44% mark. That's the same percentage of the vote, essentially, he got in 2016 and in 2020. So the fact that Donald Trump is at 43.3% really shouldn't be that surprising. I think what's more surprising is the fact that Biden is at 45.5%. Now, Glenn Youngkin is the governor of the state of Virginia. He won a pretty close contest back in 2021. He became the first Republican to win statewide here since 2009, along with Winsome Sears, the lieutenant governor, and Jason Miyares, the attorney general. But this race was incredibly close, and in a lot of ways, it was sort of a perfect storm for the Republicans. You had Joe Biden slipping in national approval. You had Terry McAuliffe, who was sort of this arrogant former governor who I think moved a little bit too progressive for the state as a whole. And you also had sort of this national sentiment against the Democratic Party. By fall of 2021, you had the infrastructure bill being put through that ultimately kind of stalled out, and as a result, Glenn Youngkin was able to win. He had a high turnout in all the areas that he needed, and he was able to energize the Trump base in sort of Western Virginia while also not really alienating suburban moderates. And this was really the perfect formula. You know, Youngkin walked the tightrope between the MAGA base of the Republican Party and the more moderate suburban faction, you know, in the suburbs around Virginia's cities. So Youngkin really did pull off a very impressive win. And that's what really put him on the political radar. And, you know, we've talked about him a fair amount ever since. Now, Glenn Youngkin is popular in Virginia. His approval has been consistently above 50%. His disapproval is usually in the low 30s, mid to low 30s. So overall, he has a net approval of around anywhere from low double digits to somewhere around 25 points, depending on the poll you look at. But he's a moderately popular governor, and considering the state he's governing is about D+10, it is pretty impressive. Now, since Youngkin's victory in 2021, Republicans have really failed to really gain more ground in Virginia. In fact, they've only lost it. The Republicans won the House of Delegates back in 2021. They narrowly lost it in 2023, and also were locked out of power again in the state Senate, which they lost back in 2019. So since Youngkin actually won, there really hasn't been much of an improvement in the Republicans' chances in Virginia. So that's one of the reasons why I think the polling in the state is a little misleading. I think when you talk about expanding the map for Republicans in 2024, I don't really think Virginia is a realistic target, at least with Donald Trump as the nominee. Now, somebody like Nikki Haley or a different type of Republican could potentially break through with these suburban moderate voters that Youngkin was able to win. But I don't necessarily think that Glenn Youngkin being on the ticket with Donald Trump would magically make Donald Trump do better with these suburban voters. In fact, if anything, I think that would just hurt Youngkin in the state of Virginia, which is one of the reasons why I don't think he's going to end up being the nominee for vice president. There's a number of reasons. I also just think that, you know, Donald Trump has his sights on other people, potentially J.D. Vance, Doug Burgum, but Youngkin's name has been thrown around. In fact, the two of them actually met for the first time, I believe about a month ago, in Sterling, Virginia. And this was the first time that Youngkin sort of started to embrace Donald Trump and MAGA, because for the longest time, even after his election, Youngkin really stayed out of the Donald Trump sphere of the Republican Party. He sort of stayed in his own lane and just continued to parrot his own brand of politics. And I guess maybe since that hasn't worked as successfully as he had hoped since his victory, perhaps he's moving in a different direction. But I would certainly argue that going full MAGA in a state like Virginia, that's very establishment, very suburban, much more politically centrist, I would argue that's not really the best move for him. But looking at the map overall, Youngkin does have an appeal among suburban upper class voters. Think of the suburbs around Milwaukee, for example, maybe suburbs outside Detroit. I don't really know much about possibly places like Bucks and Chester County outside Philadelphia. But I think Youngkin is definitely more of a Sun Belt figure rather than a Rust Belt figure. So I think his strength, if anything, to be added to the ticket would be exemplified in the South, in places like Georgia, North Carolina, places more culturally similar to Virginia. While suburbs in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania might have a similar median income, might be just as moderate economically and socially, I think there's a bit of a cultural disconnect because Youngkin is more of this Southern evangelical Republican, and typically those Republicans don't do well in the Rust Belt. Bush in 2004, even though he won the popular vote by 2 points, failed to carry Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin, albeit Wisconsin was very close, but still nonetheless, he wasn't able to carry these states. But Youngkin, I think, would help Donald Trump potentially a little bit in the Sun Belt because voters in the Republican Party who are more hesitant to support somebody like Donald Trump could potentially be swayed by somebody like Youngkin on the ticket. But I think in today's politics, given how polarized the political climate is, I'm a bit skeptical of how much of an impact the vice presidential pick actually has. Now, don't get me wrong, vice presidential picks are important, but I don't necessarily think that there's one vice presidential pick this time around that's a game changer for Donald Trump. I certainly think there are poor vice presidential picks, Vivek Ramaswamy, J.D. Vance. These are people that are basically Trump light. They're Trump, but they're not Trump. When it comes to policies, they even do some of the more divisive rhetoric and sort of this back and forth with the media. Carrie Lake is known to do this a lot. And typically when you have a president and vice president, you want to strike sort of a balance between the two wings of the party. Think about Reagan in 1980 with George Bush. George Bush was sort of part of the moderate centrist wing of the Republican Party. Obviously, Reagan was part of the evangelical conservative wing, or at least that's the sort of voting bloc that he appealed to. Not that he was really this big evangelical, but he certainly was a conservative Christian, and that was sort of the voting demographic he was courting. Bush was better for Reagan in places like the Northeast that were not as socially conservative, but were probably just, economically conservative, wanted lower taxes, less regulations. So you balance the two together, and you came up with a pretty strong ticket, one of the best tickets in American history. So, looking at 2024, Donald Trump needs somebody who's going to balance out his more brash, populist MAGA brand of politics. Now, the vice presidential pick doesn't necessarily need to be ideologically opposed to Donald Trump. In fact, it would be expedient for him, for his vice presidential pick, obviously to support all of his policies, but just strike a different tone, appeal to a different segment of voters. Somebody like Marco Rubio comes to mind because he's somebody who's seen as quote-unquote establishment. He appeals to Latinos. He's young. So you have sort of this dynamic difference between the two candidates. Donald Trump is older, more brash. Marco Rubio is sort of level-headed and sort of has more of an appeal to Latinos, suburbanites. Glenn Youngkin sort of has this natural ability, I think, make conservative policies more appealing to a moderate electorate. And that's exactly what he did in Virginia. He packaged very conservative priorities in a moderate tone, making it less scary to these, centrist voters in the suburbs who think that the GOP is just the party of Trump and is far right or something like that. Glenn Youngkin gave those voters permission to vote for the GOP again. And I think you need a Republican who's going to be on the ticket that's going to attract these types of voters, because you cannot win the 2024 election as a Republican without improving in the suburbs. You know, you would need massive gains in urban areas and the rural areas. And in my opinion, the rural parts of Virginia, especially the Southwest, are pretty much maxed out for the GOP. I mean, you know, are you going to get 95% of the vote? That's pretty much unrealistic. You know, I think the ceiling in southwestern Virginia, most of these counties, is probably the mid-80s. I mean, there's still Democrats in rural America. They do exist. So you're never going to get 100% of the vote. But you really need to chip in at, you know, the places like Loudoun County, Prince William County, in Pennsylvania. You need increased margins in Chester County. This is a county that George Bush won back in 2004. Romney won it. You need somebody who's going to appeal to these more moderate voters with a winning message. And Glenn Youngkin, I certainly think, could potentially do that. Now, in terms of expanding the map, I think that's obviously very difficult. Like I said, winning Virginia is a tall order. Glenn Youngkin makes it maybe slightly more possible, but realistically speaking, I don't think any Republican in 2024 was going to win Virginia. Even Nikki Haley, who probably would have done decently well there, especially in the more conservative suburbs, places like Virginia Beach, Chesterfield, I still think she'd probably lose the state by 3 or 4 points. So, you know, as of right now, in terms of expanding the electoral map, I think all Glenn Youngkin does is probably solidify the Sun Belt for Donald Trump, which is an area he's been polling well already. So I certainly think he's a good choice for VP. Obviously, we have to wait and see who Donald Trump actually picks. But from an electoral standpoint, I think Glenn Youngkin would be a strong vice presidential pick. He's conservative. He has good optics. He's younger than Donald Trump, and he doesn't scare away swing voters in the way Donald Trump does. That way you can have a ticket that energizes the white working class rural voters that voted for the first time ever in 2016 or 2020 for Donald Trump, while also winning back a lot of these suburban voters that have been straying away from the GOP for decades now. So we're certainly going to make another video on Republican vice presidential picks probably in the next week. Again, we're probably going to make a video about the debate because that's coming up Thursday night. So that's going to be very interesting. Very early, very odd to have a presidential debate so early. But again, politics is always changing. And especially after COVID, a lot of the conventional rules when it comes to elections are sort of out the window. And that's certainly one of them. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.